welcome to another video. Today we are doing part 6 of the Vogue 8577 sew along, and we're going to be attaching the bodice to the skirt. We're going to be doing buttons and buttonholes, and we'll be hand finishing the hem. Let's get started. Okay, so we're at step 33. We're going to pin upper edge of skirt to lower edge of middle section, matching centres, symbols and side seams. Adjust gathers, baste, stitch, trim, press seam towards middle section. Basically you're going to do exactly what they've said here. The only thing that you want to take into account is how your gathers are lying, but I'll show you how I do that when we get to it. Okay, so I've got my lining pinned in first. I have matched up the front edge, I've matched up the side seams. The next seam on your skirt will match up with the gather point on the back, on the middle back section that you marked. As you know, I cut a small notch into the centre back of the skirt portion, so I've matched that up with the centre back of the bodice, and then the same along there. So I'm now just going to pull my gathers and get those arranged nicely along that back section. Okay, so I've got all my gathers in and down nicely, so I am now going to sew at 5/8 of an inch the whole way across. It does tell you to baste in the pattern, and that again is so you can check that your gathers are lying nicely. I'm not going to, but please feel free to do so if you would like to. Okay, the seam is in, the gathers are done. I have snipped off the gathering threads. So the next thing I'm going to do is pink this seam, and then you want to press it towards the middle back. So this is the skirt portion here, this is the middle back portion, so you want to press it all up towards the bodice. Okay, so you're working with a lot of layers of fabric now, and because you've got your skirt lining on, so just when you're sewing the skirt actual main fabric to the main body, just make sure that you don't catch anything under your stitching line. It's very easy to do. Again, ask me how I know, but yeah, just maneuver your fabric carefully so that you only stitch what you actually want to. Okay, I've sewn my skirt to the bodice of my main fabric. I didn't catch anything, which is something of a small miracle. So I'm now going to pink this seam and then again press the skirt towards the bodice, the skirt seams towards the bodice. So after all that, you should be left with something that very much resembles a dress, with facings that are very much longer than you need them to be. And that's what we're going to do next, is finish off the front edge and facings of this dress. And oh my gosh, look, again, managed to get dear. Well, you're not going to see that, it's going to be on the inside. So yeah, that's what we're up to next. Okay, so you want to turn everything so that the inside out, so that the right sides are facing each other, and again you're going to make a facing sandwich. So you've got your lining, your facing and your dress fabric, and you're going to match up the raw edge from where we finished sewing before all the way down. And you're going to do that on both sides. Okay, when you get to the bottom, your lining is going to be shorter than your main fabric, as you can see there, and I'm going to do something different to finish off my facing piece than the pattern calls for. So I'm going to stop sewing when I get to my lining and leave this bit free so that I can work from the side where I need to be able to see where I'm sewing. So once you've pinned everything down, sew to your lining, back stitch, and repeat on the other side. So once you've sewn the front edges together, sandwiching the facing, you then want to press all of the seam allowance towards the lining, and then you want to continue with the understitching that we did before, and that's why we stopped the understitching as far away from the main stitching that we've just continued when we did, so that it would make it easier to do this second part. So I've actually kind of stuck my ironing board up and underneath, in between the main fabric and the lining. You've got the facing all rolled over and flat, and we're going to press all of this towards the facing. Now you are wrestling with a lot of dress at this point, but bear with it and it will be worth it. So I've got the main fabric this side, I have got the facing and the lining pushed over to this side. That's where the layer of understitching finished before. I've got a thread nest there that I'm going to deal with. So basically you just want to continue this right down to the end of the facing. So there's my understitching completed. When you're sewing, you want to kind of pull the fabrics apart like that. You don't want to put loads of tautness on them, but you want to make sure that everything is smoothed over as much as possible to the side that you're actually putting the understitching into. So I'm going to repeat this process on the other side. Okay, when you finish your understitching, you want to do it around about an inch and a half, maybe that's even 2 inches away from the bottom of your hem, because for the way we're going to finish the facing at the hem, you're going to need to be able to get in there and have some wiggle room, which if you've understitched right the way down to the bottom, you won't be able to. So finish your understitching about 2 inches away from the bottom of your hem. So the way that I'm going to finish my facing, I have the dress skirt portion right side up. I'm going to turn the facing to face it right side up, keeping the lining out of the way. And you also want to have your bias binding folded out like this. So from this side you have your bias binding folded out like this. Hopefully you can see there's the crease there from where we pressed our binding up. So you've got the skirt and the facing right sides together, and you're going to pin. And that's where the facing just about finishes. I think you can just about see it, but you'll also be able to feel it. Okay, and so what you're going to want to do, and this is the reason that I've unpicked the understitching and that I'm advising you to finish your understitching up here. You want to start sewing. This is the seam that is joined the front to the petticoat and the facing. You want to start sewing from there. You want to get to just before the crease, pivot, and then sew along side but not in the crease to the end of the facing, to about there. So I'll sew it and I'll show you. And just a quick tip, when I pivot in corners, I like to reduce my stitch width because we will be clipping out the excess. I like to reduce my stitch width and take a couple of, rather than pivot on a sharp corner, I take a couple of tiny diagonal stitches in the corner. And again, I'll show you when I've done. Okay, so started my stitching there. Reduce the stitch length, did a diagonal stitch in the very corner, stitched along back to my normal stitch length and just back stitched there. And this is out of the way, and then we have our large remaining piece of facing here. So we're now going to trim this off, and then you're going to then reduce the bulk in this corner. So you're going to want to trim very close to, but obviously not through, those stitches. You can take a little bit of this out, you want to take as much of this out as possible, And again, just take some of the bulk out from this side as well. Okay, so after trimming everything off, that is what we are left with. Then, and I'm praying I've done this right, because I have in the past done this incorrectly and sworn a lot when I turned it round and realised that I had done it wrong, because then I had a hole in my fabric. I'm going to turn it around and there we go. So once you give it a press, you have a nice sharp corner. Turn that under. Your bias binding is all ready to be hemmed. And then on the front side, that's your finished edge. So I'm going to repeat that on the other side. Once it's pressed, that is your bottom facing, and there it is from the front. Why will you not focus? Because I keep moving the thing that you're trying to focus on. There we go. Yeah, so here it is from the front. Now I got a little bit too trim happy with my facing piece. I should have left a wider amount here. So I have, again, focus. So I have a tiny little bit of fraying off from my bias binding, but I've put a little bit of fray check on that, which is fine. And I'm also going to, once I've finished hemming it, I'm going to hand tack these to the lining, so it won't show, and it's right at the bottom and it's a tiny little thing. But when you're trimming, cut lots of remove your bulk from here, but when you trim your excess facing off, give yourself more than the tiny little bit that I did, because I was just daft. So yeah, that's your facing finished. Right, so now we have buttons and buttonholes, not in that order. So the very last instruction is number 54, and it says make buttonholes in right front at markings, sew buttons to left front at markings. So it wants 10 buttons, so you have 3 on the bodice, 2 at the waist, and then another 5 down the skirt front. I am going to use the buttonhole placements that the pattern recommends. I'm going to get my pattern pieces out and lay those over my dress and actually mark it that way. Again, I will show you what I'm doing. And then I am using these shell buttons, and my lovely machine measures the buttons and then makes the appropriate size buttonholes. These, it does say the pattern does call for 1/2 inch buttons, and these are 5/8 of an inch. So I mean, as long as you don't go ridiculously large, you can get away with using your buttons of choice. Okay, so you can see on my pattern piece here, I've marked in the actual seam lines. So we have seam line there, there and there, because when you're matching this up with your dress, obviously you've sewn all your seams into it, so you need to match up the actual size of the middle front rather than try and do it like that. So you want to make sure that your corner point's in the right way, put a pin through and just mark the start of your buttonholes. Okay, so you can see here I've marked the start and the end point of the buttonholes as per the pattern. I am going to draw a line between these so it's just easier to see when I've got this under my machine, because as you can see this one here is a little bit difficult to see as is. So the last bit that I've got to do is add the buttonhole placement to the skirt portion. So I'm going to do that now. So there are all my buttonholes marked in. Now again, I've lengthened this bodice middle section by 1 inch. I'm not, however, going to fuss with the placement of the buttons. They aren't centered, but the bodice buttonholes are much closer together than the skirt buttonholes, so I am happy that these 4 are kind of corresponding. Then I have one here which is actually a good point for me on my snake corsage dress. I'm going to leave it there, and then these ones are much further apart, so I'm happy with the placement of these. You may wish to do different placement, which is totally up to you. You always want to practice your buttonholes first before you actually sew them on your main thing. If you could see Mum's face at the moment, you will know why I'm saying this. Now, according to, because I have a very fancy machine, so I can tell it I want to do an automatic buttonhole, hold the button up there, and measure it, and it will work out what the width needs to be, which is what I did for this one. And I measured it from the widest points across, but it's actually a little bit too big. So I've reduced it by 2mm and it fits much better. So I'm going to use this one as my size for my buttons. I'm going to do those next. Okay, so I've got my buttonholes in. I only had one misbehave that I had to unpick and redo, so that's pretty good. Now what I then like to do is I like to pin my two fronts together, and I match up the corners, I match up any seams, I match the bottom, and I pin all the way along. And then I'm going to place a pin through a buttonhole, and if you look at the pattern, the buttonhole, the button placement is towards the front of the buttonhole, so I'm going to place the pin through all of the layers so it will come through to the other side, so that I can then mark with my pen where the button needs to go, and I'm going to sew them on. So as you can see here, I've put a pin through about 2/8 of an inch inside of the buttonhole, and then on the other side, if it will focus, I have marked my button placement, and I'm going to do that for all 10 buttons. Once you've marked your button placement, you want to sew them on. I'm using my button foot on my machine with this little doodad down, because I need to create a shank. I don't want the button to be completely flush with the garment. I need it to have a little bit of a shank on it, so that when you actually go to button your dress up, you can do so, because it has the necessary give. So I'm slip stitching the facing to the lining, and I'm doing that by taking about, I suppose that's 1/2 an inch, 3/4 of an inch of a stitch through the bias binding, and then doing the same length through the back of the facing. So it's just basic, it is tacking it down, nothing fancy. But if you can possibly do this with a small ginger creature staring at you, or her ball, and roaring fire, then I definitely suggest that you do. This is rather nice. Okay, so I'm now hand hemming the skirt, and basically what I do is I take about a 1/2 inch stitch through the bias binding, or maybe that's a bit, yeah, about an inch, 3/4 of an inch, and then take a tiny stitch out of the main fabric, sort of 2 or 3 strands, then a long stitch through the crease of the bias binding, and then another tiny stitch out of the main fabric, and that way you've blind hemmed your dress and it looks beautiful from both sides. And once you've done this, you're going to want to give this a press again. So I really hope you've enjoyed this sew along. If you have, please let me know in the comments down below. If you do make your own 8577, please do tag me on Instagram or on here. Use the hashtag Sian made me do it, and I will be able to see everybody's makes. Make sure you tag me in your photos as well as just the hashtag. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comments down below, and also let me know what you might like to see for the next sew along, because I really enjoy filming these, so there definitely will be more. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I will see you again very soon. Bye!